Hello and welcome to everyone who has joined us so far. Here with my colleague Aaron, we're very excited to present this content to you today. And we'll get started in just a moment. See people joining, that's great. So as you come into the session, please let us know in the comments where you're signing in from, your role, and what you're hoping to get out of this session.
I see a few familiar names of some folks that we've worked with.
All right.
Yeah.
Some friendlies, fantastic.
Yes.
Thanks for joining, folks. All right, well, welcome everyone. It's going to be a great discussion. We're focused on, um, you know, bringing disparate asset data together to unify risk insights. And it's really about the role of asset correlation in vulnerability management. Quick look at our agenda here. Aaron and myself will quickly introduce ourselves. You're probably not familiar with us unless you have worked with A2 on the sales side. We'll set some expectations, what you can hope to walk away from with this webinar. We'll level set with some context about what we mean when we talk about, what is an asset. We'll talk about some use cases for what we're going to share here today, and also talk about what it looks like in action. And we're absolutely happy to respond to questions throughout the discussion. No need to wait till the end. In fact, it's better if you don't wait till the end because then we might not have time for your questions. So do please ask them throughout the presentation. So I'm Adam Dudley, and my colleague here is Aaron Attarzadeh, although we refer to him as A2 here at Nucleus. You can see on his Zoom there, he's A2. I'll quickly introduce myself. I joined Nucleus back in March of 2020. Since then, I've been immersed in this space of vuln management. I've given talks about vuln management to hundreds of security leaders and practitioners here in the US and internationally at various conferences and events. And what's most interesting to me is that in the 5 years or so that I've been in this space, the basic questions and complaints and challenges haven't really changed. I go to a big conference and I still get the same basic questions, some of which we'll touch on here today. So very excited to get into these. And A2, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah. My name is Aaron Attarzadeh, or I go by A2. I'm on the pre-sales side, so I'm a field security engineer. Work primarily with our large enterprise customers. I focus primarily on the integration of Nucleus into our customers' environments and connecting and dealing with all the different data sources into Nucleus from their environments. I'm very excited for this conversation because asset correlation is one of the main conversations that comes up during the talks of POCs and the aggregation and correlation of these disparate data sources. So this is going to be a good conversation to uncover what you may not already know that you have that pre-exists within your stack.
Thanks, A2. So we're going to have a few polls throughout this session just to keep you awake, keep you engaged while we share this content. And the first one's up on the screen. So go ahead and answer that while we jump into the content here. So, what I'm seeing very early on this poll is that we have a lot of people in the somewhat confident range that they have an accurate inventory, which is commendable. I think you would agree, A2, because,
Yeah.
we talk to many people that are not confident. Isn't that right?
Yeah. And it's okay to not be confident.
Right.
Yeah,
Exactly.
it's completely okay. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah. And it's not uncommon, right? So,
Right.
uh, but yeah, so I'm seeing like 70% someone confident, 4% very confident, 25% not confident at all. So thank you for your honesty, folks, on the not confident at all. I know that's a difficult thing to acknowledge. All right, so here's what you're going to walk away with today. We want you to walk away with a better understanding of how asset and application metadata can be leveraged in your vuln management program, basically to get a clearer picture of risk by unifying and organizing disparate asset data from many different sources across the organization. And A2, can you talk a little bit about what metadata is in the context of our discussion today?
Yeah, of course. So metadata can be anything from cloud resource tagging, such as what AWS account an asset is in, what VPC or security group is tied to an EC2 instance, all the way over to CrowdStrike agents and the tags that you're adding to CrowdStrike to the agents that are being deployed on these hosts. A lot of companies have been, historically using tags to track where an asset is, what it's touching, who's touching it. So all this underlying metadata from runtime and even at rest, right? We have repos, we have images, we have labels that are being tagged within ECR and Docker. These are all little bits and pieces of metadata. And today we're going to uncover how to utilize those to do asset correlation in Nucleus.
All right. Thank you very much. So let's get into it in level set language, right? Because we have to have a common language if we're going to talk about this topic. So, um, you know, as a sort of the less technical person on this team, I would say that I prefer this definition, which I use often when in conversation. I'll say, what's an asset? Anything that can be affected by a vulnerability is what I usually say. But here for a more detailed look at it is A2.
Yeah. So we've changed the concept of what an asset is. I think we can all remember when 20 years ago when everyone was using massive data centers, blade servers with ESXi hypervisors on top of them, and we've migrated from single data centers with one VM in an F5 all the way now to ephemeral assets and cloud environments, where now a single EC2 instance has 7 different assets that are supporting it, such as a VPC, a security group, an S3 bucket, a volume, all the way to the very far left of the conversation, which is more so your at-rest assets, right? Which is your repos, your images that are being SASed and SCA scanned and being scanned for secrets and whatnot. So we've migrated now to the breadth of the volume of assets from in the past, where applications were really only built on 4 assets. Now a single application can, and we'll uncover this in our call today, can span up to 20, 30 different assets that are just supporting an application. So,
And could we say that complexity has definitely increased over
very
time
much
in
so,
terms of
very much so,
assets?
because we're getting
Absolutely.
faster, right? We're
Right.
getting faster. We want to ship faster. So now tools are on the market that enable us to ship faster. But now that introduces a whole other side of the coin, which is you want to ship faster, you have to deal with more. So
Right.
it's grown substantially.
Okay. So, to now get into our discussion, now that we've level set what we're talking about when we say asset, could you give us a quick take on what makes asset correlation such a critical part of vuln management?
Yeah. So I look at this kind of in 2 different sides. One is to gain context of risk, which is, hey, do I have an endpoint agent installed on a server? I mandate that I must have endpoint agents installed on all of my servers, all of my VMs. The other side of the coin is cool. Once you have that correlation of scan coverage or how many different scanners are scanning this, is like, cool, uncover context now. One scanner may give you one bit of context, like, for example, an agent may give you extremely low-level context because it's embedded within the VM, versus an external scanner may give you completely different context because it's hitting from the outside. So now we're starting to bridge the gap of bringing in different bits of metadata and different pieces from the puzzle into a VM, and being able to essentially fill gaps of the different data sources. Now, the other side of this is when we want to bring in and look at every different bit of metadata, we don't want to look at 5 different assets. We don't want to look at 6 different assets all for the same host. We want a tool that's going to show us one host and the breadth of metadata and the breadth of information, including vulnerability information, all aggregated, all siloed into one viewpoint without having to jump through different menus and whatnot.
And the alternative to this is what I've heard called like the swivel chair approach, right? You're
Yeah.
navigating between many different systems, many different tools
Mhm.
to try to get that context you need on a single asset, right? Which is being scanned by multiple scanners.
Yeah.
And that's why I think some of our enterprise clients, they'll end up with over a dozen different scanning platforms, right?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
the like one of the common use cases is for us is plug in your credentials and sit back, click ingest all, and watch how all the different data sources. It's kind of a game for me, honestly, because I hop into the assets menu and I start to see like one VM with six different data sources all correlating
Yeah.
to the same VM. And when you click on the VM, you see all these gaps being filled in by the different data sources. Because no one data source is going to give you every bit of metadata.
Right.
And sometimes you have, not to say that anyone's wrong, but sometimes you have either slowed data. You may only be
Hmm.
scanning once a week versus an endpoint agent is doing real time pinging back to the collector. So it all depends on the data source and what they can give you.
Makes sense. So let's get into some key use cases then and go maybe a level deeper into asset correlation to really start to build up the picture for people.
Yeah. So when a very common use case for us is when we think of risk in Nucleus, we think of it. I kind of think of it as like an upside down tree, where the left side of the tree is the asset, and we need to have a solid understanding of what the asset is before we start applying vulnerabilities on it. And reason being here is you may have, I think we can all remember to the morning of Log4j where everyone was running around like chickens with their heads cut off, right? Is I may have 10,000 VMs. What's the quickest way for me to tackle the most important ones first? So prioritizing something that's in production versus non-production. This is an easy win for a lot of our customers. So one way that I do this is I ask them about AWS account IDs. A lot of people are splitting their environments based off of account IDs. They have completely separate resources for the different accounts. This can be done in AWS and Azure, GCP, even on-prem, really doesn't matter. Point being is that metadata that comes in from your scanner, that's an easy win for you to be able to say, these AWS accounts are in production versus these ones are in staging. That's one quick pivot point to be able to prioritize the ones that are in production first versus the ones that are in staging. Because those are the ones that are going to hit you first.
Something I'm immediately curious about is how are folks doing this without some kind of tool or methodology for
Mm.
correlating assets? Like what are the ways they're going about it or trying to go about it?
Yeah, spreadsheets. I every day I hear spreadsheets all day
Yeah,
long.
of
I
course.
hear Sims.
Okay.
I hear one person that has to pull up three different consoles and they're questioning source of truth. So
Yeah,
one scanner will tell them one thing versus another scanner will tell them another thing.
right.
Um, to this day, believe it or not, Excel.
Yeah. Now you did mention SIM, and that's a topic that comes up frequently in my conversations.
Mhm.
Is people try to do it as SIM, or they're thinking about doing it as SIM. Why is a SIM not appropriate for this kind of
Ah,
activity?
very good question. Very good
Yeah.
question. So first things first, a sim is a lot of it is like point in time data, right? So when you're dealing with a solution like Nucleus, you're looking at not a point in time, you're looking at compounded data over a like for 18 months, 3 years right now, right? And you're not just looking at the asset record, you're looking at the asset record tied to the vulnerability, tied to the instances of that vulnerability. So you get into probably 1,000 different rows per asset, and then multiplied by the amount of assets, and then multiplied over the historical time. So
Wow.
you go from a couple million rows to a couple billion rows very quickly. So a SIM is not to knock on a SIM, but a SIM isn't meant to deal with large amounts of historical data over a long period of time. And also like managing like API schemas, like I cannot tell you how many times we have to deal with APIs changing on a daily basis.
Sure.
We have a sole team where literally their day to day is managing API changes,
Right.
um, and also having to deal with downloading and ingestion and normalizing. Which normalizing is one of my favorite topics, but it's normalizing the data to all conform to a single schema. Rather
Yeah.
than looking at 10 schemas for 10 data sources, you're looking at one schema for as if it's all one data source.
Yeah. So what I heard there is a SIM is not appropriate because it's dealing with real-time data, and we're looking, we're trying to benefit from more historical perspective.
Yep.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. And I don't think we need to get into the details of why Excel might not be the best choice for this
Yeah,
work.
I still use Excel on a daily basis.
Don't we all, right? I mean, I don't think we'll ever escape it. All right, now let's jump into asset criticality. So, talking about, how does asset criticality come into play when we're talking about asset correlation, and how does that affect prioritization decisions?
Yeah. So there are, we kind of think of this in buckets, and we look at it as like critical, high, medium, low. And a critical system to us is something that is in production, something that is touching sensitive data, something that is being hit with 1,000 RPS, all day long. That's something that if it were to get compromised, that's bad for the business. We're going to lose money. And then we start going down the track of like, let's say something low is potentially like a printer in your office or is a Raspberry Pi sitting on my desk. So when we're looking at the criticalities, and this is only criticality is like one pillar of this, like what if it's critical, but it's not publicly facing? What if Adam, you are the CEO of Nucleus, and if your laptop ever gets compromised, you have all sensitive data, you have business decisions, you
Mhm.
have information, right? If your computer is a critical piece of infrastructure to Nucleus, right? So it's all in context of the customer. And an easy way, one quick way that I like to talk to customers about this, in just like the previous slide, is tell us what is a production versus staging versus QA versus dev asset. Because
Okay,
as an engineer, I have to be on the VPN to access like specific internal
right.
server. I can't go from the outside. I cannot hit that server. It's sitting behind Cloudflare. I have to be within the zero trust network to access it. So when I'm thinking of what to remediate first, I'm not going to hit the one that only one person can actually hit. I'm going to go towards the one that everyone has public access to.
That makes sense to me. And I think that one question I have there is how, something we hear is that some organizations are locked into using legacy prioritization methodologies that might not take into account enough context. And
Mm-hmm.
so it sounds like that comes into play here because I have heard stories where organizations are just trying to remediate everything, rather than trying to zero in on, where the assets that are most critical, that have the most critical vulnerabilities on them, they're actually trying to just remediate everything. And that doesn't make sense, right?
No, like a lot of customers, and every single day it's CVSS, which isn't wrong, right? We can't flat out say that CVSS is wrong. But there is CVSS is 10% of the equation, right? If and I, we have conversations a lot of the times where just in this case where you have an asset that's being correlated by two different data sources and they have the same exact CVE. CVSS base score is the same, but
Yep.
the vendor score, what the vendor actually scores that finding, completely different. And so now you get into a battle where you're essentially, it's like the Spider-Man meme where you're looking at two different
Right.
data sources and you're saying who's right and you're confused and you literally don't know what to do. And this
Yep.
is a constant conversation we're having, right?
Yep.
But
And
the whole point of correlation and normalization in Nucleus is to come to a happy medium so that the Spider-Man meme doesn't exist. So we're not being put in that kind of situation.
it's interesting you mentioned, CVSS came up. That's not the topic of this webinar, but I brought
Mhm.
it up. And I think we should drop an article. Our CO recently published an article about it's a fun article to read about CVSS. I suggest we drop that in the chat towards the end of the webinar for the team listening. And
Yeah.
looks like we have our first question. There, A2, you see that?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
So this question is about, someone recognizing there are so many tools across all the different types of scanning out there. You got AppSec scans, your SAS, DAS, SCA, IAST, your pen test results, containers, etc. And Savag is asking, do you have the ability to get all that data and normalize it and prioritize it across tools and sources?
Yeah. So we're going to be going through an example here shortly that talks about this exact question. There's one thing I'd like to point out though. So you mentioned SAST and SCA, even pen tests, right? So a lot of these scanners are actually scanning the same exact resource For example, a SAST and SCA tool may be scanning a repo versus an infrastructure scanner. You may have CrowdStrike agent, a Tenable authenticated scan, and
Hmm.
then an external scan by Nessus. So that's still all one resource. And of course, those come into Nucleus and they get deduplicated, and you have one record of truth. But we will be going through an example, Savag, of
Yep.
you have 5 different vulnerabilities from 5 different desperate types of assets. How does it normalize a Nucleus? In short, yes. And we can go into the normalization of vulnerabilities in a later discussion, but in short, yes.
It's a great question, Savak. Thank you for that. Okay, moving on. So next, for a case of what we're talking about here, runtime context and two scanner correlation.
Yeah. So we it's just like the example I've been speaking about, which is when you have an endpoint agent that's being deployed on a host, such as CrowdStrike, Sentinel-1, Qualys, and then you have an authenticated scan that's coming in, such as Tenable or Qualys, and then you have another scanner that's coming in, such as Wiz. Right, this is a very common use case where you see 3 data sources that are scanning a host.
Hmm.
Even AWS metadata, right? Like AWS tagging information. Now, the point of this is every single data source in this conversation provides different information. Like, for example, AWS may give you AWS tag information and AMI information, versus Wiz will give you if an asset is publicly facing. Versus the CrowdStrike agent that's deployed will give you the exact operating system and build version of Windows to
Mm.
denote if an asset is end of life. So they're all essentially filling in gaps of this equation in
Hmm.
Nucleus.
I think this is such an important distinction, and I don't see it talked about much that when you get to medium to large enterprise scale and you're running all these different systems, the reason they're doing that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is because they're perceiving these gaps in the information they're getting from the different scanning tools, and so then they just over time are acquiring more and more just scanning capabilities to try to have as much coverage as they can or have all the information they can to try to build this kind of contextual understanding. Is that right?
Yeah, very, very much so. I've been seeing more and more scanners. I wouldn't really say like competing with each other, but they're starting to
Hmm.
realize what they can provide more than just vulnerability information, right?
Hmm.
Like we used to get like package information and installed software information from Nessus, and that's just it came in as like informational findings, right? It would tell you
Right.
like ports are being exposed. Now we have scanners that are giving us back metadata as like we are getting risk levels from scanners, we're
Hmm.
getting network exposure from scanners, we are getting a cloud resource information, such as all the surrounding assets that are
Hmm.
plugged into a VM. So there's so much more now of data, which is a good thing, but also if you can't manage it, is
Yeah.
a rough thing to manage, right?
Right. And we know this is valuable to customers because, we're seeing them use it every day, in queries and reporting and in automations, right? Yeah.
There's another question in the chat, which
Yeah,
is
let's circle back to that real quick.
normalize as the same as deduplication. Great question. Okay, so no. So normalization is when you have, let's say, 5 different data sources, and they all have different. If you ever look at like a scan, whether it's in XML or whether it's in JSON or CSV, right? Sometimes we still get CSVs. They all have their own key value pairs and how they display the data. For example, Tenable gives you software packages in a single string that is over 1,000 characters long, and it's all delimited by pipes, right? So that's not key value pairs. Versus Qualys may give you key value pairs of the different softwares that are installed on a host. So normalization is the ability to have all these different data sources all have the same exact like schema in Nucleus, so that when you're writing your rules and you're doing automation at scale, right? Like when you don't want to write rules and you don't want to write logic specifically into each individual data source, because what if you bring on a new data source or you
Hmm.
remove a data source or something changes and then you have to go back and fix it? So what we do is we actually normalize everything to one schema. So when you're looking for software, when you're looking for AWS tags, when you're looking for exploitability, You just reference the name exploitability. You don't have to reference Qualys exploitability. It's all normalized. So you don't have to deal with all the different data source names.
Thank you for that, Raul. Hope that answers your question. Moving on here. All right, now we're getting into the real meat of this.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
take it away, too. This is your visualization here. So
So the idea here is there are metadata that exist in different parts of the cycle when we think of just like development, right? How an asset, an application gets deployed over its life cycle, right? We start with the developer. The developer is constantly making Git commits and pushing code to repos, and that repo is continuously being scanned. So on the left-hand side here, right, specifically on the left-hand side, we have our traditional SCA, secret scanning, SAS scanning, your check marks of the world, your GitHub Advanced Security, your Sonar Cubes, that are, again, always scanning these repos. And this is before it's being built, right? So now we take that repo, and that repo goes through its life cycle of being built, whether it's in Jenkins or ADO or in TeamCity. And now what we're seeing is scanners being plugged into the build process. So for example, Orca, one of our common scanners in Nucleus, has what's called a shift left scanner, where they plug into the CI/CD process, and during build time, they scan the repo, and they have the image, the SHA information that's both local within the CI/CD pipeline, but it's also sent up to Orca itself, the collector. So now we have just seen a repo be built into an image, and we have context of what the SHA is and what the tags are and what registry it's being held in. So that's one part of the equation. And so now we go down our life cycle, and that image is obviously being held in like a Docker or ECR or GCR so that we can pull it once we're in runtime. And now once we're in runtime, you have your scanners of the world that are scanning these VMs. They're scanning, whether it's running containers, and they're giving back to us what images are installed. They're giving back to us what AMIs are being deployed on these VMs. So we have the very far left of the conversation, which is we have the image, we have the repo, we know it exists, and we have the very far right of the conversation, which is we know where it's being deployed. We know what tags are associated with that image once it is pushed into production. Is it a base image, or is it a spinoff of a base image that's being used across 10 different EKS clusters that are all being deployed in production, that are all publicly facing and whatnot? So we start to get into this conversation of we now have more context at rest on the very far left of the conversation than ever before. And one thing we attribute it to is the ability to correlate everything on the far right, which is runtime context, from our scanners, the very far left, which is our at-rest scanners like SCA and SCA and whatnot.
that's helpful. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And we did get I have a question, then we have one question in the Q&A, which I missed. Sorry about that. But while we're doing that, I'm going to jump over to our next poll. So while people are answering that, so the question that came in on Q&A is how about utilizing GraphDB for asset correlation and normalization?
So and I don't want to speak for like the historical like R&D of Nucleus. Um, the way that the Nucleus architecture works is it horizontally scales infinitely. So when we get into like GraphDB, you have to still keep into account the normalization of that metadata. So you have to constantly feed it every single day, or whenever you're writing these connectors, data sources, is you have to constantly feed it new schemas and new schemas. So when we look at how we architect, is we don't want to get into a limitation of scale. A lot of customers are utilizing, pushing over 3 million assets per project in Nucleus.
Right.
And what we've seen is that GraphDBs in current day can't handle the amount of load that we are pushing into Nucleus. We've
Yep.
we have a completely like not normal architecture
Yeah.
that is insanely fast. And I've gone into so many POVs and with so many customers. And the first thing I encourage all of our customers to do is literally click the ingest all button and ingest everything into Nucleus. Like, do not
Hmm.
hold back.
Yep.
Because once you ingest everything into Nucleus, you start to see the differences between utilizing like a GraphDB
Right.
versus the Nucleus architecture. So
So the difference there is really in scale, and what's the right tool for the scale you're at, essentially.
it's
Yeah.
scale and maintenance. Um,
Maintenance.
yeah, it's scale and maintenance. I've seen like some graph DBs that like I work with a lot of the time is like limitations in how much they can return.
Hmm.
And so when we're pulling like for example like one page in Nucleus returns for some customers that have let's say 100,000 assets, that one page returns metrics for over 4 million
Hmm.
vulnerabilities,
Yep.
right? So being able to quickly get metrics and return massive amounts of load in less than 3 seconds, less than 2 seconds, it poses a little bit difficult with graph DBs
Yeah.
for our experience. Um,
Absolutely.
but open to definitely open to conversations. I'm always curious about different architectures. Like this is one part of my job that I'm so grateful for is because we touch everything. We hear everything. So I'm always excited to have these conversations with people.
All right. Please reach out to A2 for your additional technical questions, but great question. So I closed the poll, and so, it looks like 46% are focusing on high impact systems critical to business operations with regards to um, the organization's challenges. 21% prioritizing vulns in production or non-production, and 29% combining scanner data for a complete risk picture of assets. And that one's particularly interesting. That's the question I had. Um, you know, that's the reason companies tend to acquire a lot of different scanning platforms because they're trying to build up a more complete picture. So that's interesting to see that 30% of our audience here, that's what they're focused on. Also got another question here from Vince. Thank you, Vince. He's asking, how do you handle the scenario when asset correlation goes wrong? For example, merging two different assets.
Vince, good question. He knows why I'm laughing. Good question, Vince. So this is something that we take very seriously. So if an asset, and of course, like we don't just look at host names, we don't just look at IPs, we don't just look at MAC addresses and be like, yeah, cool, plug these in. It's a host name, like correlated. There's a 7 stage merging process in Nucleus, and one of the biggest keys is with IDs of assets,
Mhm.
resource IDs. These are unique IDs that will never exist across another asset,
Right.
ARNs and whatnot, right? When it comes to like if something is improperly merged, it case by case basis, we take these very very seriously, and we want to mitigate it at the root, which is something either in our host matching framework that is causing it to deduplicate and merge on accident. One thing I see a lot of the times is when a scanner actually tells us that it's a new asset when it's the same asset. So a lot of the times, if let's say you are using ASGs in AWS and you are scaling across one VM that scales across 40 different VMs, and the scanner tells you, oh, this is actually a new asset. It's a new asset. It's a new asset, but it's not a new asset. So the agent, the CrowdStrike agent, gives you an ID, a host ID that says this is a brand new asset. But when you look at the original AMI and you look at the instance ID, it's all the same asset. So it's a very much case by case basis. I don't think I have like a straightforward answer of like, oh yeah, if it improperly merges,
Yeah.
like how we fix it, because it's from AMI to hosts to even containers, or even repos. I can't tell you how many conversations we get
Yeah.
into repos deduplicating. And it's like, no, these are actually in two separate organizations in Sneak. So
So you had me at 7 stages. Like I knew it was complex when you said there are
yeah,
seven stages of identifying a unique asset, right? So this gets incredibly complicated across many different scanning platforms. So I think we got that across. And had a comment here from Kyle. Gotta love CS giving you multiple AIDs for the same asset.
my
Uh,
life.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, before we jump into the next bit here, A2, I just want to ask you, and Vince, yeah, sorry for the hardball question. No problem, Vince. He loves them, right? Yeah, I had a question, A2. So I'm curious, what would, in your experience, in your many, many conversations with our different, prospective customers and customers, at a very high level and very briefly, like, could you paint a picture of what good, better, best looks like
Ah,
where when
yes.
organizations are doing this asset correlation well or not so
Yeah.
well?
Yeah. So Best had one customer recently who completely developed their own internal CMDB from the ground up.
Wow.
And they it's best with a few caveats. And this is a very large software company, like one of the largest companies, one of the largest software companies in the world.
Hmm.
They have a nomenclature that scales across from REST to builds to runtime to human personnel. And this nomenclature, they basically use them as tags, excuse me, and they tag every single resource. So they bring all these resources into Nucleus and all the tagging information. And it's not just like tagging on VMs. It's like imagine you have an image that's being deployed. That same image is being deployed in five separate locations, like production staging and whatnot.
Hmm.
You want to be able to get runtime context of a container image, the tags of the runtime context, not the container tags, but they want the entire manifest and workload tags. So they have the whole breadth of this entire conversation. They have from very far left to very far right, and they're just using tags. But these tags are very complex. They're
Sure.
what application, where it is, what region, and whatnot. So that's like
And
best
and
case
and
scenario.
like you said, this is one of the largest software companies in the world.
Yes.
So
Yes.
they, unlike many others, have the resources to actually execute on something like this
Yes. That
internally.
is,
Yeah.
and they started with a team of 24 engineers. So that started this project.
Yeah.
They're down
Wow.
to 8 engineers that now manage, alongside Nucleus. We basically plugged into their entire environment.
Right.
And yeah, but
And how many companies are of that scale that can actually do that? Not many in our world, right?
yeah, they
Yeah.
24 engineers that were just solving this problem.
Yep.
And then on the right side of the coin, like better, I would say a lot of organizations, just like the tagging concept, but not down to the point of um, like application, location, production, staging. A lot of companies still, which I see is actually a really good thing. Like a lot of people still use like Excel with their metadata, like who owns an asset, what team is responsible for remediation on the host versus the application, right? Like what
Okay.
we can get to a larger conversation of application specific remediation versus operating system level remediation. Like you're not sometimes like the person who's remediating a Java finding is not going to be the same person that's remediating and
Of
pushing
course.
Windows October patches, right?
Right.
And then the very far right side of the coin, um, this is a most of our customers are in this boat, which is they don't know what they have yet, and it's because they haven't had a tool, or they just haven't pulled the data down to be able to visualize it. And a lot of the times it's like completely unique and desperate tagging and metadata from the different engineers and people in IT and DevOps that are tagging these assets, but completely differently. And there's no commonalities in the tagging whatsoever. So that is primarily like the more common customer that we deal with on a daily basis.
Excellent. Thank you. And had another question come in from Raul, who asked a great question earlier. He asked, with all the data that's being ingested, there will be some
Hmm.
significant overlap between the various types, SCA scan on container versus open source scan on server, etc. How is that normalized and deduplicated?
Great question. So I want to separate. There's actually three concepts here. There's normalization, deduplication, and grouping. Right. So the first thing is the normalization of the schemas so they all match. So it's so that you can look at something in on an SCA scan, a CV, or SAS scan, and then look at that same vulnerability in runtime. Right. So that is not grouping. That is not deduplication. That is normalization, where we're looking at two vulnerabilities from two separate data sources for two different types of assets, which is now when we get into the grouping side of
Hmm.
things. You have an SCA scan that is scanning a resource, such as a repo, and then you have a CrowdStrike that is scanning a host. These are two separate types of assets. So we don't deduplicate these assets, we group these assets. Because you have context at rest and you have specific context at runtime. And you don't want to basically say, like, you're right and you're wrong. Or you don't want to lose data that says, oh, yeah, I don't really care about that data. I only care about this data. So we group the data in Nucleus. So when you're looking at a finding, you see, oh, yeah, this same image that's being deployed on this host here, this is what each scanner says about this. So that's where the grouping comes in. And the deduplication side of things is when an asset is being scanned, like let's say a repo, or in this case, let's just say a VM. A VM is being scanned by three separate data sources. That same VM, that is deduplicated. And that may have, the three same vulnerabilities from all the same vulnerabilities from different scanners. But that's where the grouping concept comes in, where you don't want to necessarily just throw that data away. You group and say, oh yeah, these three scanners have this one finding. What do each of the scanners say about this finding?
Thanks for sharing that nuance. That's
Mhm.
great. We got one more question. Before that, I wanted to give you a break from talking and talk a little bit. I think this is worth talking about, these case studies we brought with us. I think they're going to be of interest. And so getting into some real world, examples. We have a large retail customer. They have over 20 different business units, each with their own disparate vulnerability management tools and processes and people running the program. And this creates a nightmare scenario for their CISO because he reports to the CTO. And with all this, um, this siloed situation, he can't effectively report up to the CTO who he reports to. He can't, the CTO asks him, what's our overall risk picture from vulnerabilities, and he has a very hard time answering that question without a lot of manual labor. Also interested in being able just to group and benchmark the different business units against one another so that and the only way you can do that is by grouping those distinct business units by hosts. And so they're primarily, their primary reason for seeking out Nucleus was to be able to create those groupings, as you were just describing, of different types of assets, and make sure that they can not only group and benchmark those different business units based on risk and how well they're doing at remediating risk, but also have a common language that they can communicate about risk. So you can't do that efficiently and add automation to it without using metadata. Is that right?
Yeah, I'm really curious. I love that you brought up the M&A piece. Um,
Yeah.
so this customer, were they dealing when they're doing acquisitions, were they looking at like a risk posture of the organizations before they essentially merged by any chance?
Yeah, so actually this is the retail customer. So um, this was more about these are existing business units just in the core entity. So this
Mm.
actually is not coming in from acquisitions.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
yeah. This is more
Okay.
the desire to group those different business units, take all the assets they're responsible for, and unify, the whole program.
See, we run into this conversation a lot with large organizations that are merging either internally
Hmm.
or externally when they're acquiring new businesses.
Hmm.
And they essentially want to see the posture of these organizations. So what they do is they literally just plug API creds into Nucleus, and they have all of the way that they are normalizing and grouping and deduplicating already set up. And remember, the normalization piece is very much key here. And they just plug their credentials in, and within hours, they have a posture of what are the highest priority ticket items that they need to address right out the gate because everything's already set up. Remember the
Yeah.
normalization piece, everything's already set up. Once you set it up, the rest is history. You just plug it in your credential. um, I like this. I like this a lot.
Yeah.
This is a common thing. I
That's
like.
great. And we have one more case study and we're coming up against time. So why don't you quickly answer Kyle's question,
Yes,
and then we'll jump into our last case study and close it up.
Kyle, great question. So ephemeral assets in Nucleus. This kind of goes in like different topics here. So I'll just talk about like containers, for example. For containers and like or even ASGs. So when we ingest container resources into Nucleus, same image across 30,000 containers, it's just that image, right? Like you're not, no one's jumping into a container and SSHing into a container to remediate it, right? So we dedupe containers by container image and also SHA and tags and whatnot. But there's another side of this coin, which is what if that image is deployed in different environments? Like
Hey,
what
two,
if you
let me
have,
pause you 1 second. We need
Mhm.
to, folks are asking what was Kyle's question. So let me make sure to repeat his question. So Kyle asks about ephemeral assets and auto scaling, and
Mhm.
uncredentialed scanning, which are two of the biggest challenges in asset inventory. And he asks if we could talk about how Nucleus deals with the noise due to those. So just want to make sure folks had the context of that
Yeah,
question. And thanks, Xavier, for keeping us honest on that one.
thanks.
Continue, A2.
Yeah. So the of course, Xavier. So the other side of this is cool. That image may get deduplicated across 10,000 or 20,000 containers. But what if they're in different locations? Like what if one's in like one AWS account versus another's in another, and you have one in staging and you have a developer that accidentally scaled up 100,000 containers. Like these are all different like runtime environments that this one image is deduplicated in. In Nucleus, we have a concept of container workloads where you can split up the different environments by both the image or you can group it up all the way to the image. I'm sorry, I botched that. You can split up by the environment or you can group all the way up to the image. So you don't really have to deal with the running container. Don't worry about that. That's on our end. You just see the end state, which is what you have to deduplicate, have to remediate. And we can, of course, get into a larger conversation around ephemeral assets such as Lambda functions and VPCs and security groups and all that stuff. I don't think we have enough time today, but feel free to send an email and more than happy to hop
Yeah,
on
yeah.
talk
We're
about
always
it.
happy to have a conversation. So thanks for that, A2. Kyle, hopefully that answers your question. No problem, Kyle. So lastly, before we wrap up here, I just wanted to share another example of this in action, a unique use case, one I'm pretty excited about. I love talking about it. But this was a regional bank that was doing something like 15 acquisitions of smaller local banks every year. So with each acquisition that comes with that company that they're acquiring comes with a whole new set of people, processes, technology. Sometime, as I learned, multiple deployments of the same security products. And so the question the security leader was asking me is, how do you quickly get data out of all these systems at the companies that are being acquired and into the main systems used at the acquiring companies level? Consolidate all that, organize it, and make sense of that data so the risk that you're inheriting from these organizations you're acquiring. And in fact, this is an especially big problem in banking, being highly regulated with significant compliance requirements. So this is extra crucial. So being able to take all these different systems and as A2 was talking about a few minutes ago, plug them into a central system and have all that hard work done for you of the correlation and the automation and leveraging that metadata to get a really quick, picture of the risk from these organizations you're acquiring, that can be game changing because of those compliance requirements, right? So you only have a certain amount of time. Once they acquire a new bank, you got to make sure they're in compliance with the rest of the organization. So I'm sure you've come across situations like this, A2, in your conversations, but I find it a particularly fascinating use case.
Yeah, a lot of mergers and acquisitions, a lot of like very large Fortune 2 and 300 companies that are acquiring new tech, or investing in new parts of the organization, where M&A becomes a very key part, not just for gaining new technology, but now you are gaining a whole new risk to the organization, right? I think we can all agree in early stages of company, we move very quickly, right? And so there's a lot of gaps that people are not making sure they cover. So understanding those gaps before you start merging their entire stack into your stack is it's a very important thing to do.
Absolutely. And I think you were telling me something earlier about, the overhead of having to adapt API schemas in the instance of an M&A kind of environment.
Yeah. So it's in Nucleus, for example, like we have over 160 different connectors, right? And we have to manage all the different schemas and API changes. So
Right.
all day long, right? Vendors are changing different keys within what's returned, or they're adding new rate limits on their APIs, or they're giving us more data that the customers want, right? And keeping up with that, and also making sure that we don't rate limit our customers. We don't put ourselves in a position where they can't get data every single day at that time, right? It is you multiply 4 data sources times the amount of all of our customers. It's a hefty responsibility. So we of course have like alerts, and very very granular alerts set up across the entire organization. So if anything were to ever happen, those become P1 issues to us. So
Absolutely. Thanks for that. All right, folks. So we are coming to the end of our discussion today. Really hope you've enjoyed this and benefited from it. Thank you so much for your time and attention today. We always like to share our upcoming webinar, which we do one pretty much every month. So the next one is February 26th. And we have this cool QR code here. You can literally scan your screen, unless that's a security concern for you, which I know it is for some. Um, so this is going to be our next webinar, from zero to CTEM. CTEM, obviously an extremely hot topic. So please do join us for that if you are interested. If anything you heard here today, if you're not already a customer and this is sounds interesting to you, like maybe there's some way Nucleus could help you, whether you become a customer or not, please do reach out to us via the website. You can also scan here to get a demo on demand. And finally, thank you again for your time, attention, and great questions. Thanks so much, everybody. See you on the next webinar.
you got it, everyone. Cheers. Thank you so much, Adam.
Thank you.